welcome everyone. Anurima, it's really great to have you with us. I mean, I've ever since Connie introduced you to me, I went through your work, and I must say it's inspiring. So for fellows who don't know Anurima yet, she's a civil rights lawyer, and she has experience in working with religious freedom, partnership, and coalition building. She's also the founder of Anthem of Us, which is a strategic advisory firm promoting dignity and justice in schools, workplaces, and communities. So Anurima, today I understand that you also are very eager to have a conversation with all of us, especially given the circumstances that are transpiring in the world right now. And I'm going to go straight into the session with our very first question, which is, how would you define inclusion and what inspired you to work for it?
Sure. So let me, Shanjini, thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for having the space and the time to have this conversation today. I want to start by just grounding us in this moment. I think it's 1:05 on the East Coast of the United States in the middle of dual pandemics, dual pandemics, one of COVID, which so many of us are experiencing in different parts of the world, and then the pandemic that we've experienced around the world as well, of what it means to be in systems of oppressive and racist policies that have really dehumanized people in so many different ways. And so and then to be at a moment where we're seeing the economic impact of that in really brutal ways as well. And so I sit here on a day where that is what is certainly part of what's on my mind and what I've been working towards. And the question of inclusion has to be answered in that context for me, right? Which is what inclusion means on its surface and what it often has meant in the context of work we do in the United States. We like to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion all the time. I don't use those words mostly because I want to talk about dignity and justice. Because if I think about it, it's diversity, but we're diversifying from what? Equity, I think about, and I think working for equity is extraordinarily important. It's just what's our baseline for that? And for inclusion, we talk about diversity being the chance to be invited to the dance, and inclusion being able to dance to your own song and to your own rhythm. I think of inclusion as a moment where we can each of us could be free to be who we are, to bring our histories, to bring who in this moment, for example, our grief, our rage, our loss, our communities into spaces without fear and anxiety of what that might mean. And so that's the richer definition of it, I think, in terms of what kind of work we're trying to do. And for us to be able to look at each other and to feel each other and to love each other with a certain type of respect and dignity. And so that's how I think of inclusion. I think it doesn't change in terms of these times, but I do think what these times have revealed for so many of us is a way in which we haven't necessarily even taken the first step towards that moment.
Sorry, I was muted. So that's a wonderful analogy when you said the diversity is being invited to the dance, and inclusion is being allowed, being able to dance your way to your song. I mean, I've never really thought about it that way, and that's really wonderful. What inspired you to work for diversity and inclusion?
So I sit on the south side of Chicago. It is where I grew up. I am the daughter of immigrants from India who decided to live on the south side of Chicago, which is a place that when we moved there and still is predominantly Black, and a community that is where we live is a 4x4 block area, a neighborhood in the midst of a neighborhood that I was planning to talk about. So I'm going to talk about it now, which is the larger neighborhood and community of which I'm a part is one that has struggled with a lot of the conditions that this moment in our history in America has revealed. We're in the middle of a societal X-ray, and when we look at what is happening in our communities like mine, where we have the highest number of I'll just start from now. We have the highest number of COVID cases in the state of Illinois, where I live. We have close to the highest number of deaths. Part of the reason for that is that there's been significant disinvestment in the community over the years. Our schools have closed. We didn't have a health center, one where people could go if they were in trauma until 2 years ago. After a long battle, we didn't have a grocery store that people could actually get a wide variety of food to eat. After it took a 7-year battle to get a grocery store in our neighborhood, and we see all of the kinds of disparities that are being revealed, and so 80% unemployment for young people in our neighborhood, and so when you see all of that, for me, the question was just, what's the ways in which I can contribute, and that meant, as a young person, I wanted to be a doctor. I thought that's the way I could help people. I got to college and didn't do so well in organic chemistry, and that was the end of my doctor career. And then I thought, what are the other ways in which I can do that? And I learned about the civil rights movement. I learned about education, and for me, being in public schools on the south side of Chicago, I had all the privileges in the world from my parents and the opportunities that they provided for me. I also watched my classmates, who were some of the smartest and are some of the smartest and most insightful humans that I have ever come across, and saw the kind of obstacles that were in their way. And so I wanted to work on civil rights in schools, and that's what I did for most of my professional career. First at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and then and I also worked in school districts like the New York City Department of Education. And then I worked at the Justice Department, and at the Justice Department, this question of diversity and inclusion is to me part and parcel of our work towards civil rights, towards racial equity, to creating a society and a community and a nation where frankly, us civil rights lawyers would be out of a job, right? And so that's where the impetus for the work comes from, which is really rooted in recognizing that I was able to have a trajectory that many around me were not, and how do I fight to make sure that that's something that that everyone from my neighborhood and from my community can enjoy.
Right. And when in your work, you must have encountered very many different viewpoints. Tell us a little about that, your experience, and how you bring together people who disagree. How do you build a diverse coalition? So
I'm going to jump and talk about some of the work you mentioned at the beginning, which has not been work that I have engaged all my life, but it's something that I've been doing more recently. And I think maybe some of you would have thoughts and questions about this. And let me just say, I had said to Shinjini and to Lizzie and everyone that, like, if there's, I want this to be a conversation with all of you today. So, like, if there are questions you have as I'm talking, please put them in the chat or whatever works for you. If there are questions, if you want to raise your hand, I know some of you are raising your hand to wave or to sort of affirm, and I appreciate that. But if it's hard for me, the way the screen is for me, I can't see all of you. But if you have questions, please just put them in the chat, or I'm happy to clarify along the way. But I really just want this to be an opportunity for us all to really ask questions that are hard and might be ones we all want to talk about in this time. So with that, let me talk a little bit about the work that I've done in the last year and change as a U.S. Commissioner on International Religious Freedom. In December of 2018, I was appointed by our Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, to serve as a commissioner on of international religious freedom. I don't know that much about religion. I have learned more in the last year about religions and religious practice that I had never encountered, much less heard of, in countries around the world. But the work that we do on the commission is work that is very much aligned with the work that I've done throughout my life, which is how do we allow for space for people to practice their faith, to show love for one another, to be in community, and to do so in a way that is free from persecution and violence and fear. And so that work has taken me around the world. The reason I raise this in response to Shanjini's question is because I joined a commission with where my fellow commissioners are people who, particularly in terms of what we've worked on domestically, are people I never imagined I could even be in a room with. They have worked, as much as I've worked for the civil rights of certain communities, they have worked to take away those civil rights equally as hard in many cases. And that includes in areas like sexual violence and sexual assault. It includes in terms of racial discrimination. It includes how we treat the LGBTQ population within community within the United States and abroad. And so in so many ways, I think that there's that being able to be in a room with them was something I didn't know how that would work for me. And some people were unfortunately lived up to the standard that or the expectation that I had. One of my fellow commissioners, the very first thing he said to me was, hey, I don't think I'm gonna, I think I'm just gonna call you commissioner because I don't think I can pronounce your name. And I'm very much a believer that you start as you mean to go on. So he's a little bit shorter than me. So I leaned over into his ear and I said, so this is how this is gonna go. I'm gonna whisper my name into your ear over and over again until you say it out loud and you say it properly. And that's how we've been since then. And the next day we were in the middle of the United States Congress in the Senate meeting room, and there was a hearing, and I was sitting next to him, and I thought, okay, well, I'm gonna sit between him and another one of the very conservative commissioners, and I'm gonna write my name on a big piece of paper next to me. And I said, well, if you get bored during this meeting, you can keep practicing my name. Because I don't understand how someone can say that they are going to stand for the rights of religious communities around the world and can't pronounce the name of the commissioner that's standing next to them, who is a part of one of those communities. But what has happened over the course of the year is that we found an extraordinary amount, not with him, unfortunately, but with others, an extraordinary amount of common ground. And it's been, I have traveled to, last year on this day, I was coming back from the Rohingya camps in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, and I went to Burma, and I went to Vietnam and Iraq, and to Sudan earlier this year. And I have done that with my fellow commissioners in a way that we have not only learned to have respect and honor one another, that I found faith in them in some of the hardest times in this country. I've been able to, just 2 weeks ago, one of my fellow commissioners was one of the people, a week ago, gosh, it feels like it was ages, was one of the commissioners who came out in praise of the President of the United States, gassing protesters and going out for a photo op and saying it was a moment of strength. And so I got to write to him about what I thought about that moment. And I think in some ways being able to write to him and being able to have him say, a few weeks before that because of some of the conversations we had, he actually encouraged very conservative leaders, evangelical leaders and others to come out and condemn some of the killings that we have seen of members of the Black community. Those are things that have brought me, some faith. And I've done that also with, I took one of my commissioners who I couldn't understand how he could be for families in need, and watch what was happening in the U.S. in terms of the separation of children from their moms and their dads and on the border, and not be outraged by that. And he said, you know, I've been asked to go to the border many times, but I want to go with you. And so he and I, without any pomp and circumstance, just went. And I thought, maybe if we see the same things, maybe if we take out the filters of the media and what communities we hear from and see the same things, we might be able to move in the right direction. And I just got an email this morning asking if he might sign on to a letter to Congress to support some of the students here who we expect a decision about the Dreamers and whether or not they're able to stay in this country in a number of different ways, and so how we can actually support them. And I'm in a position now where I can write to him and ask him to do that. So I think part of it is actually sitting and having conversations, which we have not been able to do without, you know, a lot of the hoopla. And I do that by going knocking door to door on political campaigns, and I do that by trying to have conversations with my commissioners, and to get over the fact that you know, what we might disagree in vehement terms on so many things, but we can also come together to fight for some other things too, and that's been a revelation for me.
That's inspiring. And you just told us about how there are, I mean, in your work, you worked for communities that have been separate from the mainstream. So what are the elements that play into the marginalization of a community? And do you think these elements overlap at all? If so, how?
Yes, I think it's dehumanization. I think it's othering, right? I think that's what we see in communities around the world. It is a sense. A lot of times, it's fear that then turns into the blame and the torture of others, to be able to grapple with your own fears, and that can be a range of things. But I think in the end, you know, we see communities around the world facing the same patterns, and we've seen them for hundreds of years of how it is that we marginalize, how it is that we other, and how does it that we dehumanize and treat people without dignity, so that they are then subject to all of the horrors that we see from not being able to eat or to get healthcare, to violence and you know, mass incarceration, and even genocide. You know, we've seen that over and over again. And if I think about you know, being in Burma and being able to meet with the leadership in Burma, which I know, you know, many of you who are in this program and others have so much more deep knowledge and experience than I do in your home countries and around the world. Just for me, the very idea that I stood in front of the head of intelligence services and the head of the police, and they couldn't acknowledge the Rohingya community, the existence of the community itself, much less the violence that had you know, befallen so many and thousands, was such a pattern that we've seen over and over again, and that frankly, truth commissions and our efforts to try and bring some sense of remembrance and memory in times that we've seen such violence, that's always been to in some ways to recognize both the existence and the humanity of those who people want to erase, frankly. And so I think that's true, whether it's, you know, a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, or it's millions in a country that have then been displaced. I think it's the same, it's in so many ways the same kinds of mentalities that get us there.
And do you think inclusion in terms of race, religion, sexual orientation, etc., can reshape the world the way it is now?
I think it's reshaping it right now. I think the tough part of, and I know there's a lot of questions, and I'm trying to look at them and take them in, and but a lot of what we're seeing right now is a moment in which I think we're reshaping. There are things that were radical 2 weeks ago that don't feel so radical now. There's movements that I could never have seen. I spent Saturday talking to attorney generals here in the United States about how do we make sure we look into what we call would be a larger scale investigation of the Minneapolis Police Department, where Minneapolis is where George Floyd was killed by Chauvin, Derek Chauvin, and with 3 other police officers also charged. But the question is, how do we actually look at the police department and all of the ways in which the system itself and the practices of that system contributed to that moment of violence? And that's often what I want to look at, which is not just the moment of violence, but what led up to it and then what comes after it, right? And so we were talking about that. I couldn't have imagined on Saturday that on Sunday we'd have an announcement from the city council in Minneapolis that they may not have a police department at all, right? That's their intent. And so this is a time, right? It's a time where, on the one hand, like, there's such extraordinary despair and loss. There are personal losses that we're all carrying. There are losses that are our very sense of what we're close to, what's proximate changes when, I can feel as close to you being halfway across the world as I can to the person next to me in the way in which we're sitting right now, right? Like that's what this world of Zoom and everything else has done in some ways, right? But the very nature of what it is that we are feeling and how we're feeling it, I think is creating a space in some ways for transformation and to reimagine and redesign. And I don't mean to say that we don't sit and take the time to do that, not in to try and do that not in a reactive way, but in a way that's really going to recognize what it is that brought us to this place, particularly in the United States, which has just been abysmal. I don't even know what the words are for how it is that we've handled the last couple of months, but I do think that there's an energy and there's a desire and there's an openness right now that I hope that we, as people have talked about this time as a portal, I hope it's brought some light into the portal so that we can see a different path ahead.
And that's interesting. One of the questions that have come up on the chat is for international visitors like us observing these events unfolding in the US, both police brutality and widespread protests, how do you think? What do you think it's important for us to know about the current moment?
I think there's probably, I think there's a lot to understand about the current moment. I think first and foremost, I'd say that what we're seeing is, people are saying that the system is broken. And in many ways, I think for the United States, the system is doing what it was designed to do. We have for a very long time, back from, for the last 50 years, created a system in which, we incarcerate more people than any country in the world. We do so with significant disparities on the basis of race and class. We do so as, with great concerns about the way in which justice is meted out, meaning who's picked up and why, and whether or not, and whether or not there's any ability for someone to overcome the very idea that their race or where they live is going to, be weaponized, or they're going to be found guilty for that alone. I think that that the cost of that has been significant de-investment in communities in terms of education, which is what I have obviously spent most of my time on, in education, in mental health, in addressing trauma, in addressing the kinds of inequalities that I mentioned in my neighborhood. And so what we're seeing right now is all of these forces of the continued, not only the disinvestment, but then the sheer dehumanization and hate of communities, Black men and Black women, Native American men, Native American women, Latinx men, Latinx women, and I could go on of the ways in which those communities have borne the brunt of brutalization and militarization of America. And so when you're looking at, but what I would say is when you're looking at the other piece of this is some of the narratives that are coming out about the kind of response that we're getting, and I think it's really important because it's hard for any of us. Is that there have been peaceful protests in the thousands around the United States and around the world, and it's been extraordinary to see. There has also been those who, there are those who decided that this would be an opportunity for them to engage in violence. Some of those are people who are very different from those who are out protesting, and others, like those in my community, who were out last weekend and looting. And I'm very careful about how I use that word, but let me just, who some say liberating, and I would probably use that word too. It's important to understand hopelessness at this moment in the United States, right? Which is in the last couple of months, there's been $434 billion that corporations have made in the course of the COVID pandemic, and there's 40 million people unemployed in the United States additional. So we're seeing people who are literally the only way that they can imagine getting food or diapers or clothes right now are to walk through, as there's many who've eloquently said out there, walk through a broken door or broken window to get that. And that's what is so fundamentally sad about this time for me, is that that it's laid bare so much of that. But I'm seeing my community, like people in the thousands trying to get meals because last week everything got shut down. And so I think trying to understand what you're seeing is, I think you're seeing what what the violence of America and the creation of a system that has privileged the wealthy and the corporate throughout its throughout the last 400 years. We're seeing what that means in terms of poverty, of despair, of hopelessness, and those are structural issues that and racist policies that have led to that in so many ways. So that's a very long answer to a not so long question.
How has it been for Anthem of Us over the past few days, and tell us a little about your work there?
Yeah, I mean, I think for anyone who's trying to do this work right now, it's really difficult because sometimes we've been engaged in what I would call the work of the head, the work of our minds, trying to address, figure out policies, address policies. We've been trying to transform spaces and do that in a way that as we often talk about, like, how much heat is too much to bring to an organization and to a space, and some of your questions go to that too. And then comes this moment where you both, like, we're sitting in such despair where, I've been in conversations over the past week and a half, where people are like, the biggest burden for me right now is not being a Black woman on the South Side of Chicago in all of that pain. It's the idea that I actually have to sit in a room with white people. And I have to sit in a room with, like, white colleagues or friends and try to explain this moment to them, right? Or try to even have an understanding of that pain. And so how do you have a conversation in such pain, in a time of such pain? How do you actually try and do work that is going to honor that pain, and is also going to take account of the fact that there are people who are so earnestly and lovingly trying to figure out what they can do, right? How to learn, how to explore, how to transform, how they've seen something that they didn't see before, and that, I think, has been the difficulty for for so many, which is just how do we create some spaces and support those spaces for learning and transformation at the same time that we're trying to create and support spaces for pain and grief and loss that is beyond palpable. I mean, and so I think that's been and for me, like, I didn't realize, even for myself, like, you know, I got to Friday last week and I couldn't function, and I haven't been in that situation for, I don't know, a decade, where I literally had nothing left. And so how do we actually also think about how we take some space in the middle of a time that is so lonely and isolating in so many ways, in terms of COVID? How do we actually create some space to fill up the well too? So I think that's the challenges of this time for our work, and how to, you know, I go to sleep at night both being like, I didn't push hard enough and that I wasn't radical enough for this moment, and then also going to sleep at night being like, maybe I pushed too hard, and you were looking at a bunch of people who like couldn't take any more today, right? You know, like that's part of it too. And also just dealing with, you know, I'm not, you have to reflect yourself and account for your own biases and histories and experiences too. And, you know, I certainly have them as well. And so I realize I'm an Indian woman who happened to grow up on the south side of Chicago in a Black community. I am not Black. And so there's no amount of racial resumeing that I or anyone else can do to account for the fact that I too have privileges, extraordinary privileges. And what are the ways in which I can feel part of community, and what are the ways in which it's my time and my responsibility and duty to be able to use those privileges to advance what is needed for communities around the country. And I think that's been, you know, a reckoning for any one of us who's sitting in the midst of this and trying to open our eyes too.
And does with the present situation with COVID and everything else that's going on, do you think inclusion kind of changes? Does it need to change the way it's implemented or defined?
Yeah, I've actually been heartened by the calls to be like, and apologies for my language here, but like, there's been a bunch of calls of like diversity and inclusion are sort of bullshit right now. We should get, you know, we need to move into a very different conversation about liberation, about justice, about belonging, about what it means to build very different communities. And it's a more, and what does it mean for what is it, you know, Trevor Noah talked about this the other night. What does it mean when the social contract between us has been broken, and what do we need to do to create a very different sense of what that contract is with one another? And that's not diversity and inclusion, which still centers, you know, white people or those who are in power in terms of who we're diversifying from, right? How do we change that conversation? And I think that's part of what's happening right now. I think there's some significant questions about how that will continue and what does that mean going forward. But I do think that the very idea of, I mean, in some ways we have a couple of different shifts happening. We have a bunch of places that never really thought about diversity or equity or inclusion. Then we have some places where they've thought about that a lot and now are trying to move to something different. Which is dignity and justice. And then we have some people who are like, the very simple question, right? That we've been trying to pose, which is, clearly something needs to burn. It's not our neighborhoods, right? But the very question of what needs to burn so that we can actually be in a community in which we're centering love and liberation and justice and dignity, that may be, these concepts of diversity and inclusion. But I think, we have to think about like the pace of that and what can people hold and how, and what can they hold well right now too. And so, I'm still grappling with some of that, which is how do we actually bring some people into a richer sense of what that language is and what it means and how to implement it. And then how do we actually bring others into a space where they can figure out how that might not work for what it is that they're trying to do right now too. So I think it's going to be like a ongoing conversation, but it is a conversation. And I probably had 20 requests from private companies, including like private equity firms, about like, we want to do diversity and inclusion work. And you're like, okay. But I've also had people who are like, I can't, we've got to move away from that. And so there's something happening here. I'm not sure if I can capture it all easily.
Okay. Let's move to a few questions from the chat as well.
Yeah.
There's some, we have one question which asks, how do you stay encouraged in your work? I find it often difficult to continue the fight when you see how unbreakable discriminatory systems can be.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a couple things, which is part of the way that I've kept it going is to try, this is going to sound, I'll try to answer it more richly in a moment, but like I've tried to change my tools over time. And so part of what I've been doing is, I was a civil rights lawyer for a long time. I decided that I don't want to litigate cases anymore, not because I don't think that the law and the litigation world is something that is critically important and perhaps even more critically important in this time. But I started making and working with people who are doing documentary films. And so I produce documentary films. I create spaces around the world for documentaries that are from communities, many of the communities that you are grown up and part of. And so that we can tell stories differently, we can change culture. And I guess what I'm saying is like, when you're beating your head against the wall and it feels like it's really bloody, I've tried to find other ways in which the light can come in or that I can actually go search out the light. And that's been part of the way in which, one small way in which I've tried to handle what I feel like can be complete disheartenment about how to do this work. The other is that I'll just say simply, like, there are people who have reminded me to have faith, right? And that, like I gave the example about 20 minutes ago about my fellow commissioner who wrote me and said, hey, Ahmaud Arbery, who was killed in Georgia, he's like, it was a moment where like I had just watched a bunch of the work that I had done on sexual violence be erased by the Trump administration. And I was having a really hard time. And I was like, what's the point? Like, we spent 15 years, working on this, and like, it's literally erased, and erased in a way that was so irresponsible and dangerous. And I get this text message from him where he's like, hey, we put out this statement and, our conversations helped me get there. And there was something, and I just started crying because, it's those moments, right, where you shift a little bit of something that I think has given me a way to keep going and to some of the questions, like, I haven't developed hatred in my heart. I haven't developed hardening in my heart. I think in some ways that's what's done it. And also, I think more than anything, being around kids is what changed. I mean, listening to kids, being around kids, seeing the world the way that they see it, even in this time where you would think that like the trauma that they're going through, we forget to think about the trauma of kids. We think about our own in these moments. But if you don't have kids sitting next to you and pulling on you all day long, sometimes it's hard to imagine what they too are going through. And even in that, like, I think that's where I've always looked for renewal of faith in the work and what we're trying to do.
Nasreen asks, how do we start a difficult conversation? How do we be conscious of our unconscious biases? And how can we help each other be better humans?
Well, Nasreen, that's it's a very simple question to answer in a few minutes. I think I'd say a couple things, which is looking at ourselves, taking that time to understand what we're bringing into a conversation, reflecting on that, reflecting on the fears and the insecurities that we each have, the anxieties that we each have. I think that's, I mean, being the awareness of that and the ways in which that's the part that I think is a, you know, the way in which we can be better to each other in conversation and in difficult conversations, and also in as humans. You know, I used to, if you asked me a month ago, I would have thought, like, you know, the part of me that doesn't like to talk in the language of like love and kindness all the time. I was like, all right, you know, like we need to go get some stuff done, right? I've been talking a lot more in the conversation of love and kindness, and I really think like it's. I wish I could pull it up for you, but I'll send it later. You know, it's the small happinesses, the little kindnesses. I think if we can engage in those, and we can engage in those in the small conversations, we can also engage in them in the larger ones. And I'm firmly of the belief that like my service in this time is as much about you know, having a conversation this morning about with a friend who is like literally falling apart as a Black man in America who's been trying to tell a very different story and maintain his humanity and saneness, and to spend some time with him is just as important as, like, you know, having a tough conversation you know, with the heads of our foundation tomorrow. I mean, it's just so both of those things are important. I would say, like, this time is so overwhelming that I would think about the ways in which we can start small. And you know, I tell people, like, invest $10 or invest one small kindness. That's the way this starts. And I think in this moment, realizing like what we're bringing to conversations and looking around and being able to like understand the kinds of traumas and the kinds of pains that people are bringing in is also the way to do that.
So the little things add up.
Excuse me?
So the little things that, taking from what you just said,
it's not even that they add up. I think the little things are the big things.
Okay.
Right? Like, I think it's both of the, but I almost believe that, like, you know, I had an older brother. He passed away 5 years ago, and what I learned after he passed was the ways in which he had shown up for people at like 2 a.m. when they just needed someone to check in on them. And I heard countless stories of that, right? And people might have looked at him and been like, what was he doing all that time? You know, what was he working on? And it was only then that I literally changed my life in that moment, because I wanted to try and be present for people differently who are in my life. Because I realized that, like, that is what it is that people will take and remember, and we'll give them courage, and we'll give them faith, and we'll let them feel a little bit less alone. And being able to say to people that, to say to someone who's sitting next to you, that even if we have differences, even if that we're with you, that we're part of the same community, like there's something really important about that right now. So I just keep to the fact that, like, sometimes it's really hard to do the big things, and you get your head bloodied a bit. And then I have faith in the small things. And I know how much they have meant to me too in this work, is to have that kind of renewal and community around me, which I hope and expect, and have heard from all of you that you know, and even if it's like having had a few moments with you all as your you know, some of your predecessors on a dance floor, I know that you're creating that kind of joy and space for one another too. And I think that's the magic of these communities that we're in, whether it be Atlas or whether it be your community that you grew up in, or any other global community that you're a part of.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That means a lot. Pratyush is asking, what are some ways to keep policy level debates and dialogues non-partisan, especially when media tends to view most things through a partisan lens.
Yeah, I think, I mean, one of my greatest sadnesses is the ways in which we've been so polarized by the idea of partisanship and media and disinformation and people feeding into, the ways in which we are different. And I certainly fall into that too, right? Like I am not at all immune to it. And what I would say is that in many ways, like again, realizing that most people are out here, and we've seen it in the streets all week long. Most people are out here because they do care about the person who's sitting next to them, and they do want to try and do better, and they do want to be part of a community in which love and dignity and values, and we can talk about what those values are, prevail. And that we do actually have a shared set of values. I ask people those questions all the time, even in small spaces. Like, I will be in the middle of a foundation, which for example, and people will literally be like, I can't talk to anyone here. And you ask them their values, you ask them what they're there for, you ask them their mission, they ask them what they want to bring into the space. And it's so similar. And in part, they just haven't opened up to share that. And so I think, I would just say this, which is, Scott and I are both part of a program. It's how I met Scott, Scott Beal, that put a bunch of us who are on different sides of the political partisan spectrum into a space together. And I don't even know what some people's partisans, I don't know which side of things they're on. I do know that they're family to me, and that they have been a place where in the darkest of times, they have shown up. And so I think trying to find spaces where that can be created, that was more important to me than any other thing that I got out of that program, was this family. And so I would just think about how to think about that even for yourself and in Atlas and in other spaces that you're in, which is in the same way that someone is like, I always joke that like, I couldn't imagine being in the room with the conservatives that had tried to tear down a lot of the work that I'd done. And then I realized that they were saying the same thing about me, right? And so, which I thought, I was like, how could that be true that you didn't want to sit in the same room as me? But I realized that like, part of this is just sitting down and having a conversation. And I know that sounds totally silly in some ways, but like, it is what has changed some of this for me. And to realize that like, you can find common, and we have great in common with so many people who we may look at and feel like we don't. I'm gonna run through some of these, Janini, which is, do you have research that we can read? Yes.
I wanted to get to that as well.
And then I think there was some questions about gender and religion, which yeah. Yeah, please.
Yeah. So the gender and religion, for as far as that is concerned, Saket wants to know if we reject gender discrimination in every other arena, how do we accept it in religion? Do you think religion is a barrier to gender equality?
Well, I'm going to suggest that the beginning of that conversation, the beginning of that question is not. I certainly don't think that we've supported gender equality in every other arena. I think we have a long way to go on gender equality, whether it be that the impetus for it or the reason that someone gives is religion, or the various other reasons that we hear every day about why it is that we allow for the brutality, the dismissal, the violence that we see towards women and girls, and in certain circumstances, many circumstances to men and boys too. So what I would say about that is, I think that there are practices that people engage in, and so the question is, and I think maybe this is coming up. Yes, I agree. Religion should not be used to limit women's rights, and it should not be used to limit the rights of LGBTQ communities as well, which we've seen around the world. I also would say that that there's the question of whether or not religion is being used, right, as a justification for, as a way to allow for discrimination by gender, or if it is what has given rise to it, right? And what I've seen, I think, around the world is that oftentimes religion becomes the ways in which people justify their prejudices and their actions and their violence, and as a reason for, right, in ways that are highly problematic. But I guess what I would say is, like, part of what I've tried to bring to our work on the commission is a lens. I mean, is literally a lens of saying, like, we have to look at gender equality. We have to look at the rights of women and girls. We have to look at the ways in which religion is playing out for LGBTQ communities, in particular because those things can't be divorced from one another in so many parts of the world. So I'm not suggesting that they are not integrally connected. I'm just suggesting that, like, you know, I think there's, in the way in which I see it, there's gender inequality all over the place. There are certain ways in which it has become even more brutal and concretized in the context of religion in some places. And also I would say that, like, you know, as I've learned about religion, and as I said, I didn't have as much of a background in religion itself. But I think that what I've learned is that there are, you know, they're constant threads, right? Like, there's ways in which we could think about the constant threads that are pulled out and that are highlighted by some for their own use. And there's also these rich legacies of a very different kind of sense of power. You know, I always like to, I'm of Hindu background, and I always like to tell the stories of, there's a story of a demon that couldn't be killed by any of the Hindu gods. And so of course, and it wasn't one of those moments of, like, somebody proclaiming, like, this demon won't be killed by a man. That wasn't it. It was that women actually came together, the female gods came together, right, and joined forces and joined power to be able to defeat the demon. And I think there's, like, all of these wonderful stories of the ways in which we could think of the community that religion brings differently when we think about gender, and bring those threads through as well. But yeah, I mean, I've seen, unfortunately, from female genital mutilation to you know, the ways in which we've seen women and girls be the place where religious violence has, like, landed. 8-year-old girls being raped as a way to, like, you know, as a way to get back at a particular religious community. You know, we've so long seen the ways in which women and girls are the place that fights land, that others are having. I don't know. So that was also, like, not a very good answer to the question. I'm rambling, but I hear you all, and I just would say, like, I think religion exacerbates it in many places. We should fight to change that, but certainly gender inequality and trafficking and violence is something that happens outside of religious context all the time.